She wasn't just solving math, she was rewriting the rules. Little did Mrs. Wallace know, Brenda's genius was about to turn the classroom upside down. What happens when the student becomes the teacher? Welcome to our channel. We appreciate you joining us and enjoying these incredible teacher-student tales of triumph and growth. If you love these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Let us know in the comments if you've ever faced a similar challenge in school and how you overcame it. Now let's continue with the story. There's more to discover. It was the first day of kindergarten, and young Brenda sat at her desk, eyes wide with curiosity. The room buzzed with excitement, the walls bright with colorful posters, and the scent of new books hung in the air. But as the teacher began writing on the board, Brenda's thoughts turned to the numbers that didn't make sense to her. She was always a quiet child, observant, and quick to catch on to things, especially words and letters. But math, especially multiplication, felt like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her teacher, Mrs. Wallace, was a strict woman who demanded that all the children memorize the multiplication tables. Every day, she would call out numbers and expect the students to chant them back in unison. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6, the teacher would say, her voice rising with each number. But for Brenda, it felt mechanical. It felt like a song with no meaning. When it was Brenda's turn to answer, she stumbled over the numbers, trying to recall the multiplication tables she had been forced to memorize. Her mind blanked. She couldn't remember the answers, and the pressure built with each second she hesitated. Mrs. Wallace looked down at her, her eyes narrowing. "Just memorize it, Brenda," she snapped. "You'll get it eventually. That's how things work around here." Brenda's heart sank. It wasn't just the numbers that confused her. It was the idea that there was only one way to learn. There was no explanation, no deeper understanding, just memorization. Every day, Mrs. Wallace would stand at the front of the room, repeating the multiplication tables, expecting the children to echo them back. The same pattern, over and over again. But Brenda couldn't help but wonder, why are we memorizing this without understanding it? It didn't make sense to her. As the days went by, the other children seemed to pick it up easily. But for Brenda, math felt like a never-ending puzzle, one she couldn't solve. The tables were just numbers to memorize, with no logic behind them, no explanation about how to figure them out. Why not teach her how to break them down, to understand what they meant? But each time she asked a question, Mrs. Wallace's answer was the same. Just memorize it. One afternoon, while the class was practicing the 9 times table, Brenda's frustration reached its peak. Mrs. Wallace stood at the front of the classroom, arms crossed, glaring at the students who struggled to keep up. "Brenda, why can't you just memorize it like the others?" she asked, her voice sharp and cold. "How are you ever going to succeed if you don't know this by heart?" The room went quiet. The other children turned to stare at Brenda, their eyes wide with expectation. They had all learned the answer they were supposed to memorize, but Brenda was different. She didn't know why the answers mattered or why she had to remember them without understanding why they worked. What was the point? Brenda's cheeks burned with embarrassment as the teacher's words echoed in her head. She wanted to explain, to tell Mrs. Wallace that she didn't just want to repeat the numbers. She wanted to know how they worked, how to figure them out on her own. But she didn't know how to say it, how to make the teacher see that there was more to learning than just memorizing. Taking a deep breath, Brenda raised her hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she was determined to stand her ground. "But why do I have to memorize it, Mrs. Wallace? Why not teach me how to solve it?" Mrs. Wallace's face flushed with anger. "Because that's how math works, Brenda," she snapped, her voice icy. "Don't question the system." The class shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of the kids snickered, while others looked down at their desks. Brenda could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The other students had learned the answers by heart, but she couldn't. She wasn't interested in just memorizing numbers. She wanted to understand them. But Mrs. Wallace wasn't interested in hearing her question. She wasn't interested in teaching Brenda the process, only in the result. The answer, memorized. That was the goal. But Brenda wasn't the kind of child to give up easily. As Mrs. Wallace continued with her lesson, Brenda's mind whirred with thoughts of how she could solve this on her own. She was different from the other kids. She didn't want to simply memorize the numbers. She wanted to learn the why behind the equations, to discover how the numbers fit together. And so, she quietly began to make sense of it on her own. Brenda took the numbers and tried to break them down in her head. She didn't need to memorize them. She needed to understand them. It was slow at first, but Brenda wasn't in a rush. Each day, she worked on it by herself, figuring out how the multiplication tables could be solved. Brenda had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let Mrs. Wallace's way of teaching stop her. If no one else was going to help her understand, Brenda was going to figure it out herself. And that's exactly what she did. The next day, when Mrs. Wallace asked the class to recite their multiplication tables, Brenda smiled to herself. She wasn't just repeating the numbers, she had solved the problem. But how would Mrs. Wallace react to this unexpected approach? The challenge was just beginning. As the weeks went by, Brenda's frustration with memorization never fully disappeared, but her mind kept working, constantly trying to make sense of the numbers in a way no one had taught her. She wasn't content with simply memorizing the multiplication tables. Brenda wanted to understand why they worked the way they did. She started writing the numbers down in different ways, drawing pictures, and making patterns to visualize the relationships between the numbers. Every time she looked at the table, she saw something new, a connection that no one had ever mentioned before. She would spend hours on her own at the kitchen table, creating her own methods to break down multiplication. It was like piecing together a puzzle. Each time she got closer to solving it, the more excited she became. And then one day, something clicked. The numbers finally made sense. She figured out how to multiply 9 by 6, not by memorizing the answer, but by understanding the logic behind it. She saw the pattern, understood how the numbers built on each other, and realized there was a better way to approach the problem. With a burst of excitement, she raised her hand in class. Mrs. Wallace had just asked the class to solve the 9 times table. "Mrs. Wallace, I figured it out," Brenda called out, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "I can solve it without memorizing. I understand how it works now." Mrs. Wallace looked at her, her expression tight, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. She hadn't expected this. "That's nice, Brenda," she said, her voice colder than it had been before. "But you're still going to have to memorize it. No one cares about your method." Brenda's heart sank. Her excitement faltered as Mrs. Wallace dismissed her discovery with a wave of her hand. The teacher wasn't interested in hearing about how Brenda had figured out a new way to solve the problem. To her, memorization was the only way, and nothing else mattered. It didn't matter that Brenda had worked hard, that she had found a solution that made sense to her. What mattered to Mrs. Wallace was that Brenda followed the rules and memorized the answers. Brenda sat back in her seat, feeling small. The excitement she had felt a few moments earlier faded, replaced by a sinking feeling in her stomach. But as the class moved on, she reminded herself that it didn't matter if Mrs. Wallace understood her method. What mattered was that she understood it. She had cracked the code, and no one could take that away from her. Even though Mrs. Wallace had dismissed her, Brenda wasn't going to stop. She kept solving problems on her own in secret, using her method to break down each multiplication problem. Every time she worked through a new set of numbers, Brenda felt more like a true mathematician. Someone who understood the logic behind the numbers, someone who didn't just memorize, but solved. As she continued to find patterns and connections, Brenda's confidence grew. She was solving problems in a way no one else had taught her to. Her method was unique, and even though Mrs. Wallace didn't care, Brenda knew she was onto something bigger. She had unlocked a secret to learning, and that made her feel like a genius, even if no one else saw it yet. One afternoon, Mrs. Wallace stood in front of the class with a new challenge. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the quiet tension in the room. Her eyes scanned the class, pausing for a moment to glance at Brenda before speaking. Today, we're going to test how well you know your multiplication tables. If you can't memorize them, you'll fall behind," Mrs. Wallace declared in a voice that seemed more threatening than usual. The words stung, hitting Brenda like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the implication. To Mrs. Wallace, memorization was the only thing that mattered, the only way to measure whether someone was succeeding. Brenda had known all along that this day was coming. She'd spent weeks trying to make sense of the multiplication tables on her own, trying to understand the why behind the numbers. But now, Mrs. Wallace's challenge felt like a wall that Brenda couldn't climb, a reminder that understanding wasn't enough. That night, Brenda tossed and turned in bed, her thoughts racing. She couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Wallace had said. She was already falling behind, just because she wanted to understand math rather than memorize it. It didn't seem fair. She was capable of so much more than simply repeating numbers by heart. Why was no one teaching her how to solve them? Why was no one valuing the way her mind worked, the way she could think through problems? Her frustration kept her awake, her mind restless, wondering if anyone would ever understand that there was more than one way to learn. She wasn't going to just memorize the answers. She wanted to solve them. She needed to show someone that there was more to math than what Mrs. Wallace was teaching. The next morning, as Mrs. Wallace called on the students one by one, Brenda's nerves fluttered in her stomach. When it was her turn, she didn't hesitate. She had made up her mind. She wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Her hand shot up in the air. "I don't want to just memorize the numbers," Brenda said loudly, her voice steady with determination. "I want to show you how to solve them. I can figure it out without memorizing." The classroom fell silent. Mrs. Wallace's eyes narrowed, her face darkening. She wasn't used to being questioned, and she wasn't going to let a 5-year-old challenge the way she'd taught for so many years. "What do you mean, solve them?" Mrs. Wallace asked, her voice sharp and dismissive. "You're just 5 years old. There's no way you can solve multiplication." But Brenda stood firm. She wasn't about to let her teacher's words make her doubt herself. She had figured it out. She knew how multiplication worked, not just by memorizing, but by understanding how numbers came together. She had the answer, and now she was going to show it. "I figured it out. I can show you the answer without memorizing it." Her small hands gripped the chalk as she walked to the front of the class, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She stood in front of the chalkboard, ready to prove that there was another way, a better way. Brenda started to draw the numbers and symbols, showing the class the steps she took to solve the problem. She didn't just write down the answer. She explained how multiplying 9 by 6 worked, how it made sense. She broke it down in simple steps, using patterns she had discovered in her own way. The class watched in stunned silence as Brenda showed her method, her hands moving confidently across the board. They had never seen anything like this. They had memorized their tables. But Brenda wasn't just repeating numbers. She was showing them how to think about multiplication. The numbers weren't just random things to memorize. They had a logic, a rhythm, and a meaning. Mrs. Wallace's eyes widened, her jaw tightening as she watched Brenda's chalk move across the board. She had never seen a 5-year-old do something like this. She had never seen a child understand multiplication in this way. Brenda wasn't following the rules. She wasn't just memorizing answers like everyone else was expected to. She was thinking for herself, and that made Mrs. Wallace uncomfortable. The other children in the class gasped, their faces filled with awe and confusion. Some of them whispered to each other, amazed by what they had just witnessed. Brenda had done it. She had solved the problem in a way that made sense to her, and it wasn't just about the answer. It was about how she understood the process. Mrs. Wallace, however, was not pleased. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and she glared at Brenda. "This is not how we do things here," she said, her voice cold and unforgiving. "Memorization is key, and you are only 5. You have no business solving problems in this way." Brenda stood there, her heart racing. The teacher's harsh words stung, but they couldn't take away her achievement. She had shown them all that there was more to math than memorizing numbers. She had proven that understanding was just as important as remembering. And though Mrs. Wallace didn't appreciate it, Brenda knew she had unlocked something important, both for herself and for the rest of the class. The following morning, as the classroom hummed with the usual excitement of a new day, the door swung open, and Principal Mr. Thompson stepped into the room. Mrs. Wallace had called him in to discuss what she deemed to be Brenda's unusual behavior. She was concerned about Brenda's defiance in class, how she had disregarded the rules of memorization. But when Mr. Thompson saw what was on the board, his reaction was not what anyone expected. Brenda's multiplication solution, written out in her own method, was on full display. The drawings she had made, symbols, patterns, and connections, were all there. Mr. Thompson stood in front of the board for a long moment, staring at her work. His expression shifted from confusion to astonishment, as if a new world had just been revealed to him. He had never seen anything like it in all his years in education. "Is this her work?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Mrs. Wallace, who had been watching nervously from the back of the room, nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone no longer confident but tinged with embarrassment. "But she's only 5 years old. She's not supposed to know this. She should just be memorizing the tables." Mr. Thompson looked up at her, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, Mrs. Wallace," he said, his voice firm but kind. "This child has an extraordinary gift. You should be fostering her ability, not stifling it. Brenda, you're a genius." The words hit Brenda like a wave crashing against the shore. Genius. She'd never thought of herself as anything special. She was just a little girl who had found a way to make sense of the numbers in a way that felt natural to her. But now, with Mr. Thompson's words, it all felt different. What had seemed like a personal breakthrough had now been recognized as something much bigger. She felt a sense of pride rise inside her, like she had just won a battle no one else had even known she was fighting. The recognition from the principal felt like a victory. Her victory. She had done something no one expected from her, not even her teacher. And in that moment, Brenda realized that her way of thinking, her creativity and curiosity, was valuable. It wasn't just about solving math problems. It was about the ability to think critically, to understand, to break things down and rebuild them in her own way. From that day forward, Brenda's school experience would never be the same. Mrs. Wallace, though begrudgingly, had to admit that Brenda's way of thinking had opened her eyes to something important. No longer was it just about memorizing answers. It was about understanding the why behind those answers. It was about fostering a deeper connection with learning, one that encouraged curiosity and independent thinking. Mrs. Wallace, despite her initial resistance, began to see the value in Brenda's approach. But for Brenda, it was more than just about Mrs. Wallace's change of heart. She had discovered something about herself that no teacher or class could take away. No matter how much anyone tried to push her into a mold that didn't fit, Brenda realized that her ability to solve problems, to explore the world through questions and patterns, was something unique. No one could stifle it, not even Mrs. Wallace. Brenda's challenge wasn't just about proving she could solve a math problem. It was about proving to herself that she could think outside the box, that her method, her way of understanding, was just as valid, if not more valuable, than memorization. The real lesson wasn't in memorizing numbers. It was in learning to trust her own abilities and intuition. As Brenda sat at her desk later that day, she smiled to herself. She had shown everyone that the best way to learn wasn't always about memorizing facts and figures. Sometimes, it was about digging deeper, questioning the process, and finding your own way of solving the problems life throws at you. And no one could take that from her. If you were inspired by Brenda's journey, like this video, comment where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs a little inspiration, and don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting stories.